Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there
if
for
anything
a
happened
fight.
to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was
the
chaos.
weather was so bad there would be
I used to
nobody
run
left.
with boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms,
Chances of
screaming.
survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family.
And the plane burst into
proud of the
flames.
crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm
To
doing.
volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Only 5 years after World War II, countries from around the world were embroiled in a new conflict. 21 nations, including Australia, committed air, land and sea forces to South Korea's defence when the North invaded. 17,000 Australians served. But what does the average Australian today really know about the conflict? Angus Hordern spoke with Australian War Memorial historian Michael Kelly to discuss the forgotten war.
I'm Angus Hordern, and today we're speaking in Canberra at the Defence Force Academy with Michael Kelly. Michael, it's great to have you on Life on the Line.
Thank you very much, Angus. Thank you for having me.
Michael, we're going to chat at length today about the Korean War. But before we do, I want to understand your passion for it, how you have served in the Army, and now your involvement with the War Memorial.
My interest in Korea started as a child. When I was growing up, reading history books at primary school, I saw obviously with the First World War and Second World War, there was this little war called Korea. And it sort of always piqued my interest. And I always read little bits about it through high school or through primary school and then high school. And then once I joined the Army, I was posted to the infantry. And on joining my battalion, I was told, you will learn your regimental history and there'll be a test. And the first war of the Australian Army, the regular army, was the Korean War. So it was that really piqued my interest, and because there was a lot of veterans around at the time, we were able to access a number of them. I was based in Queensland at the time. Some of the Queensland veterans were bumped into just in the streets sometimes, and just chatted to them during remembrance days and selling badges for legacy. So just conversations with veterans, even in the street, and just kept my interest going over all these years. And being now at the War Memorial for over 14 years, it's been a fantastic way to repay that interest in Korea, but also to the veterans themselves as well, because Korea really has been that war that fell between the cracks of the Second World War and Vietnam. So to give them their time in the air, which they well and truly overdue, it's nice to be able to do that in my role.
So Michael, what made you leave the Army?
I joined the Army at a time when it was during the Ready Reserve Scheme. So I was a member of the inaugural, one of the inaugural platoons that actually went into Kapuka as part of that scheme. So it was a year full-time service and 4 years part-time service. And by halfway through my part-time service, I'd wrecked my knees and had to be discharged from the Army. So any ideas I had of a full-time career in the military was sort of broken early, which was disappointing. But things have worked out really well since. So I don't regret the way it ended.
So how did you leave the Army and end up at the War Memorial?
I sort of, when I left the Army, I went back down to Victoria, where I was living at the time, and just worked a few different jobs. So mainly retail, but I always had a hankering to do something with history, but I had no clear idea of what. It was when my wife and I moved up to Canberra for her job that I thought, the War Memorial. And so I literally kicked in the door as a member of the casual staff, and 14 years later, I'm still there. So it's a fantastic thing to be able to do.
Oh, good on you. I mean, I share your enthusiasm for the War Memorial. Like, if I ever come to Canberra, it's always to the War Memorial first, and then I'll do something else. And I totally agree with your passion for history as well.
And it's been such a great time for me working there as well, because there's been so many different periods of change over the last decade, and even being able to be involved in things like gallery redevelopments and exhibitions and things like that. It's been a real buzz to actually be able to tell the stories of our veterans through the gallery displays and interviews and things like that.
And indeed, before we leave the War Memorial, a large part of that surely has been the impact that the current director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, has brought to the role.
Certainly. He certainly has brought a lot of energy and drive And you see that in a lot of what's going on with things like the last post ceremony and also a number of the gallery displays like the Special Forces exhibition that's on at the moment. So it's a great tribute.
Actually, I can testify to that. I saw that exhibit yesterday with Dr. Carl James, who was in charge of it, and it's another excellent production by Carl and the War Memorial.
Most definitely. I got to work with Carl. He's my colleague now, but I got to work with him when I was a curator in the Heraldry and Technology section on the Second World War redevelopment. So working hand in glove with him with his history knowledge, but also with myself and another colleague with our objects and history knowledge. We worked really well together as a team, and now working in the team with him as a colleague is fantastic. I couldn't ask for a better role in my life.
So, Michael, let's chat about the Korean War. What was the background to the start of this conflict?
Basically, the background began at the end of the Second World War with the division into North and South zones along the 38th parallel. But you can draw that back to the Japanese occupation of Korea in 1910. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea and basically tried to white ant or destroy the Korean culture and language and things like that and make it part of their Japanese empire. And from there in the 30s, they then invaded China as well. So Korea has been this traditional invasion route for armies, ancient and modern, over centuries. But as the Second World War came to an end, Russian forces started to enter through Manchuria, down into Korea. And the Americans realized that, they're going to have a Russian presence right on the Japanese doorstep. So they actually put a force ashore, and they did agree the demarcation line was going to be the 38th parallel. So the two zones came into existence in 1945, and they were the North Zone and the South Zone. So they weren't independent countries at this stage. That didn't happen until 1948. But basically the North Zone was communist controlled and the South Zone was capitalist controlled or American controlled. But one of the things that the Japanese had done was basically take out all the heads of any of the independence movements or strong leadership of Korea. So there was no one leader that Korea could really reunite or unite behind at the end of the Second World War when the push for independence had really come along. So the North Zone under the Russian influence became staunchly communist, and same as the South, it became staunchly capitalist. So you've got Kim Il-sung in the North, who's very much Russian and Chinese backed, and also in the South, Syngman Rhee, who is very much an American puppet, I guess you'd say. But he very much had his own ideas as well. So pretty soon after the demarcation line was drawn across the 38th parallel, there's a very nasty sort of civil war that begins. And so you've got a lot of parties sort of heading north and south to try and destabilise each zone. But there's also a lot of communist sympathy in the south. So there's a lot of almost a revolution of sorts in the south as well. So there's a fairly brutal repression which is undergone in the south, say in the 1940s. But as that built up in the north, the Russians were backing the North Koreans. A lot of these North Koreans they basically had a ready-made army because they'd fought. A number of them had fought in Russia during the Second World War, but they'd also fought in the Chinese Revolution as well on the communist side. And as that war had ended, a great portion of the North Korean forces actually came back into what had become North Korea in 1948 and formed the North Korean People's Army. So they had a very much a combat-tested and hardened army with Russian material such as tanks, T-34 tanks, artillery, and even some planes. But the South, the Americans didn't want to overly arm Syngman Rhee, who was also quite belligerent and wanted to go north and reunite Korea. So they actually didn't more heavily arm the South Korean, started off as a paramilitary before it became the Republic of Korean Army during the Korean War. But they basically had no tanks or heavy vehicles and minimal artillery. So it was a very much a paramilitary force rather than a standing army that the North Koreans faced.
So, Michael, am I correct in seeing a parallel here between what's happening in Korea and later what happens in Vietnam?
In a way, yes. Vietnam War is actually running concurrently with the Korean War. So the French are actually fighting the Indochina War at the same time. And the Americans are actually bankrolling the French because of a deal with bases, military bases in France. So the Americans are actually funding a lot of the French actions that they're fighting against the Vietnamese in Vietnam. But the Korean War starts off, and it catches the Americans quite by surprise. I mean, they really shouldn't have been that surprised because they were well aware what was going on, obviously with their advisors and their the military mission in Korea. So when the North Koreans cross the border in the early hours of the 25th of June 1950 and start driving on towards Seoul and then down the peninsula, it really does catch the Americans largely on the hop. And the infantry division, that's the 24th Division over in Japan at the time, is not a bad state, but they're not in a state where they've actually got a lot of heavy weapons and tanks and things like that. So a task force gets put across very quickly into Korea, which is Task Force Smith, which thinks it's going to have a fairly decent walk in the park against these soldiers from the north who they don't rate. And Task Force Smith gets well and truly beaten at a place called Osan, and then is forced to withdraw. The remnants of it are forced to withdraw back to what then becomes the Pusan perimeter.
So isn't this interesting? Again, we're seeing a Western force underrating an Asian force.
Very much so. And it happens to the French in Vietnam as well. The colonial masters have that colonial master mentality. They don't rate the locals, and it's to their own detriment. They realise by the time Dien Bien Phu happens in 1954, when the Indochina War ends, that the Viet Minh are by far the superior force. They can move heavy artillery in jungles literally with manpower alone, which actually gets Dien Bien Phu is surrounded by high hills. And the Viet Minh actually get heavy artillery pieces up into these hills through terrain which would be impassable in thought to most people. And they then shell the airfield, which is in the low ground. And the French are then forced to capitulate after a pretty serious battle. But same thing in Korea. They initially underestimate the North Koreans, and they think they're going to be a walk in the park, and they're anything but initially.
There's a lot we can talk about Korea. However, on this podcast series, in the interest of time, can we focus on Australia's involvement?
Australia is involved very quickly as the war begins. Literally, the Navy is committed straight away. The Shoalhaven, the HMAS Shoalhaven and HMAS Bataan are committed as one's already in Japan and one's about to be relieved. Both of those vessels are then committed to escort duty. So they are very much, as part of the first convoy going over to Busan, they're providing escort duty. The Air Force, which is 77 Squadron, they had literally just finished packing up their aircraft and had their goodbye party to Japan and were on their way about to go back to Australia. The morning they wake up from their party, they realise there's something going on in Korea, and they literally have to unpack their planes. General MacArthur asks for 77 Squadron personally, which is granted. And the Australian pilots are really well renowned and regarded in Japan by the Americans. And literally, one of the Australian pilots is known as the best air-to-ground gunner in the theatre, and because of this squadron's reputation, MacArthur wants them, and they are literally flying combat operations back within a week. So flying from the airfield in Japan with a map in their laps straight over the ocean into Korea, and then flying combat ops and then flying back. But it's not until the breakout of the Pusan perimeter where the airfields actually start to move onto the Korean peninsula. So it's literally flying by the seat of your pants sort of stuff.
I know MacArthur's amazing attack at Incheon isn't an Australian involvement, but it is a game changer in the event. Can we speak about that?
Very much so. It's the Australians aren't involved, but British Royal Marine Commandos are. So it's a Commonwealth. There is a Commonwealth connection to it. But the landing at Incheon allows the breakout from the Pusan perimeter a couple of days later. It's basically using landing craft to break into the Incheon harbour and land against seawalls and flat areas, and then start to push in towards Seoul. What they had to get right here was it's a very high tidal area, so tidal ebbs and flows with the Incheon harbour. They had to get it absolutely right for timing, otherwise the landing craft would have been marooned on mud and would have been easy pickings for the North Koreans. And as it turned out, they got the tides quite right. They were able to effect the landing and then move in towards Seoul. But the North Korean defence fighting back towards Seoul was quite dogged, so that the Americans didn't get into Seoul as quickly as they would have liked and weren't able to cut off as many North Korean forces as they would have liked as well in the pincer movement that was part of the breakout from the Pusan perimeter. So a lot of the North Korean forces were actually able to escape as well, but a number were left behind as holding forces.
A lot of people have criticised MacArthur for being a big risk taker at Incheon. However, they failed to remember that he had so many landings in the Pacific. Like at Leyte, they put more troops ashore than the Americans did at D-Day. And his experience with amphibious warfare was well known and experienced through the Second World War.
Very much. And you can have a podcast series on MacArthur alone. I mean, this landing at Incheon is literally his high tide point. After that, it starts to go downhill. The Australian infantry, or the army, is committed in July of 1950, and they don't actually arrive until late September, when 3RA arrive in Korea and are then attached to the British 27th Brigade, who are a battalion short in their brigade. And they do a bit of patrol work behind the lines initially, and are then involved in MacArthur's operation that crosses the 38th parallel and drives on Pyongyang and then on towards the Chinese border. So the Australians see their first ground combat at a place called the Apple Orchard, and their commanding officer, which is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, He's also seen a lot of combat. He's a 39er from the First World War. He served in the Greece and Crete campaigns. He was had to escape and evade from Crete with some other guys, literally taking a boat and sailing away and getting back into Africa that way. Fought in the Pacific campaign, and at the age of 25 was the youngest Australian battalion commander of the Second World War, taking over the 2nd 11th Battalion. But a lot of the men he ended up with in Korea as well, people like Bruce Ferguson, Ben O'Dowd, he'd served with them. He'd commissioned Ben O'Dowd in the Second World War, and these men had never forgotten it and had stayed in the army. But he knew these men, these senior officers of the 3rd Battalion, when he was posted up to command it in August of 1950. He literally had only weeks to weld basically a battalion that had been on occupation duty since 46, when they arrived from Morotai. Basically only had weeks to get them into a combat readiness. And this is a number of men coming back out of Australia as part of what was called K-Force. So the government actually raised 1,000 men, a volunteer force of 1,000 men as part of K-Force with Second World War men. And they were then shipped up to 3 RAR as well. And K-Force actually continued throughout the war to keep the other battalions, 1 and 2 RAR, fill them up and make them combat ready as well. But 3 was the first combat unit on the ground. But the Apple Orchard was a short, sharp action north of Pyongyang, where 3 RAR attacked a North Korean regiment from behind. They were more focused on the American paratroopers that they'd actually cut off and were taking a toll of. And Charlie Green, when he encountered these part of this North Korean force, literally attacked his men off the march. And it was the untried men that were first into combat, and they excelled. And they suffered 7 men wounded, but the action was a cracking success. And a North Korean regiment was put to rout, which was amazing. So considering it was literally a couple of companies that did the bulk of the attacking against a North Korean regiment. So
first engagement, great leadership, took the initiative.
And Charlie Green is, a bit over a week later, he's killed or mortally wounded and dies of his wounds. And he's the only battalion commander in the Royal Australian Regiment to lose his life in combat operations. He was really well regarded and could quite well have been one of the future leaders of army, even though he hadn't completed high school himself. And he was so highly regarded for his leadership that he'd actually been pulled off his command course at Queenscliff halfway through to be sent up to Japan to take over from an inexperienced battalion commander who had seen service in the Second World War but hadn't commanded a battalion. He'd been as far as a company commander. But Charlie Green was so well regarded that he was literally pulled off this course halfway through and sent to command 3 RAR and sent to Korea.
What a great loss of a great man.
Absolutely. And his wife Olwen's written a beautiful book in tribute to Charlie. And she's done so much for Korean veterans, recording their memories, recording their history. And she's never forgotten her love for Charlie and never remarried.
Well, thanks to you, we won't forget him either. So Korea is largely an army action. But can we just touch a little bit more on the Navy and Air Force's role?
All 3 of the Australian commands fought as separate entities. The Australian Defence Force didn't actually occur until 1975, so they're fighting under American commands. The Navy actually is involved on the West Coast mainly with shipping interdictions and things like that, but in 1951 the carrier HMAS Sydney is sent up for a combat tour as well, and using the carrier for the first time in Australia's naval history in the role it was intended to fly combat air patrols and combat operations. They did an amazing job using Sea Fury, Hawker Sea Fury aircraft and also Fireflies, which is a 2-seater reconnaissance aircraft, but also can be used to bomb and strafe as well. But thousands of hours of combat airtime attacking bridges, trains, troop build-ups, things like that. So they didn't get so much into the dogfighting, which is more of what the Air Force and the British Navy aviators did. And also the Americans. But the Navy flyers were mainly involved in attacking ground targets in North Korea or in North Korean territory, but also when the Chinese came in, they were attacking Chinese targets as well. So, but the ships were involved in a blockade force, and the aviators were flying combat operations over the ground as well. So,
but significantly, as you say, that Michael, the Air Force and Navy are coming under American direction.
Very much. And the 77 Squadron fight in some very significant actions in MacArthur's push up towards the Chinese border to try and reunify Korea. The 77 Squadron actually get based at a place called Hamhung, which is up in North Korean territory. And they fly air support when the Chinese actually start to come in and push the UN forces back. When the Americans get involved, the Marines and the Army at the Chosin Reservoir, the 77 Squadron actually fly combat patrols or combat operations in support of the US Marines at Chosin. But they're also doing, for the very first week of the war, they're flying operations against troop trains, road transports, any sort of major concentration, supply bases, things like that. They're attacking them. So literally from Japan right through to several different Korean airfields, and mainly they're based around K2 at Seoul. But they do see some action up in North Korean airfields as well, and over Pyongyang. So they are wide-ranging. In April 1951, 77 Squadron are withdrawn back to Japan, and they undergo a period of change from Mustang propeller fighters, to the Meteor jet fighter. And this takes a little bit of time to do, and they have to get British pilots out from the RAF to help them out, because there's literally not the pilot power in the RAF at the time to maintain the squadron strength. So the British pilots are not only training them to flight the jets, then they actually deploy with them with jets as well. And 6 RAF pilots are actually killed with 77 Squadron, and another one is shot down and taken prisoner, as well as 6 RAF guys as well. So 77 does see some pretty heavy combat. When they do change over to jets, they are initially deployed up into what's called MiG Alley, up on the Yalu, around the Yalu area, and they come up against the MiG-15. And the MiG-15 is a superior air fighter, has got a tighter turn, higher flight ceiling, and is just a better fighter in general than the Meteor. And a number of Australian pilots are killed in combat operations against MiGs. And there's only very limited success with Australian pilots shooting down MiGs. What the Australians really would have loved was the US Saberjet, but there was not enough production at the time for the Saberjet to go into Australian product or Australian hands. So you see a lot of we stuck with the Meteor, but they then, after they were withdrawn from the MiG Alley, they're then sent back down to support ground forces in doing air-to-ground attack missions.
Michael, when we drove in here today, we drove down Kapyong Road. What's the significance of Kapyong?
Kapyong is a battle which is fought by the Australians, Canadians, and the British of the 27th Brigade and New Zealanders when the Chinese launched their 5th phase offensive coming back down the peninsula in coming to the war. Kapyong is literally a last-ditch stand in front of Seoul to stop Seoul falling back into Chinese hands once again, or North Korean hands once again. Kapyong, the 1st Republic of Korean Army Division, which is forward of the Australians who are actually resting at the base of Kapyong Valley, preparing for Anzac Day of all things. They are aware that something's going on. The Chinese actually crash into the ROK Army, South Korean Army, and pretty much annihilate a division and put the survivors to flight. So they're streaming back down the Kapyong Valley with refugees as well. And the Chinese are actually able to infiltrate these refugee columns as they're coming down the valley. The brigadier who was in charge of 27 Brigade, where the Australians were serving under, had changed Brigadier Code, Aubrey Code, who had seen the initial combat, was out of the line with a health break. That was Brigadier Brian Burke, who was the acting brigadier at the time. So he actually had control of where he'd placed his forces. And just forward of Kapyong is a triangular series of hills. And the Australians were put on to the right flank, the Canadians over on the left, and the Middlesex Battalion was actually meant to be on the forward triangle hill as well, with the Kiwis back down the valley, Kiwi artillerymen down the valley. What had happened was the British Battalion, the Middlesex, were actually forced to go forward. So they left the hill and were supported by New Zealand gunners. They went forward up the valley to try and actually stop or at least slow down the Chinese offensive. But they ended up being overwhelmed as well and having to withdraw. And they withdrew in good order. But they weren't able then to reoccupy their positions because of the close pursuit, and actually had to go back further down the valley towards the Kapyong town and hold a base down there. And the New Zealanders had to re-register their guns, and it was a pretty tight-run thing. And they couldn't actually get proper registration done before the combat started to happen. On the 23rd of April, so the Australians had been expecting to celebrate Anzac Day or commemorate Anzac Day with the Turkish forces and also their British compatriots, but it wasn't to be. They were instead sent into their positions in the Kapyong Valley, and then were fighting literally a hand-to-hand action, what became a hand-to-hand action very quickly afterwards. 3RAR's headquarters wasn't actually up in the hills with its companies. The brigadier had actually placed the battalion further down in the valley, and so the battalion headquarters further down in the valley. So they weren't actually in full control of what was going on up in the hills. The Chinese attacked out of the refugee column and hit battalion headquarters first. So BHQ was actually fighting the Battle of Kapyong first before the forward companies were. So the companies were engaged very soon after, but they had to fight a pretty severe and close quarters action down in the valley first, and then they withdrew back down into near the Middlesex lines as the battle unfolded. The Chinese hit B and A companies, which were the two forward companies, on slightly separate features on their hills. They were pretty hard pressed, and B company actually held firm, and A company fought a pretty tough action overnight, but were forced to withdraw, and the whole battalion literally withdrew as a consequence in close combat with the Chinese. They couldn't disengage and get away quickly, but they literally fought a withdrawal back down their mountain range, and it was the Canadians over on the other hill who were fighting their own battle who were actually able to support. It was about a kilometre away, but using their heavy weapons to shoot across at the Chinese and allow the Australians to disengage. But it was a very, very close run thing, but you can never also put too much credit on the Kiwis. The New Zealand gunners were fantastic. Because they were a bit short of ammunition as well, they were able to use their artillery pieces to very effectively, with short barrages or short shoots, to stop the Chinese from overrunning Australian positions. And they also supported the Canadians the same way, almost down to individual shells landing in front of foxholes. The New Zealand gunners were that good, and they had a high reputation throughout the entire Korean War.
And Michael, what sort of numbers are we talking about? Numbers of Chinese attacking us?
You're literally looking at an entire division, so over 15,000 Chinese by this stage.
And how many guys have we got deployed?
The Australians have got, I think it's less than 800 as part of the battalion at the time. The Canadians about a similar figure, so a brigade is roughly around about 1,500 men, but with combat effectiveness at the time, it was a bit less than that as well. So they're literally fighting. A brigade is fighting off a division-sized attack.
Yeah, so there's this huge disparity, and despite holding the high and good ground, the fact is, you're flanked from behind, and it's really a desperate struggle.
Very much. Kapyong is a desperate struggle, and the Australians prove their mettle time and time again in holding the Chinese back. And when one of the companies puts a radio call out asking for assistance, they get onto the US Marines, who are not too far away. But the US Marines actually don't believe that the Australians are there anymore. They believe they've been wiped out. But the Australians hold on and are actually able to withdraw in good order back down into the Kapyong Valley and rejoin the battalion. The Canadians hold firm on their hill, and they're able to stay there until relieved by the Americans on Anzac Day. So this is it's a big fight. And
were the Canadians as pressed as we were?
Very much so. They weren't as hard hit initially. The Chinese had literally focused on the Australians, trying to literally break the brigade apart. But the Canadians also had very much foxhole to foxhole fighting and a lot of hand-to-hand in the front line before the Chinese actually withdrew from their positions.
So let's go back to the Kiwi artillery that's tasked with the support. What sort of units are they fighting with?
They've got the ubiquitous 25-pounder artillery piece. They're one of
World
the
War II vintage.
Queen of the battlefield in World War II.
Yeah.
So this is their artillery piece that stays with them throughout the entire Korean War, and they are so effective with it. They have a huge and high reputation, and the Australians loved working with them the entire war. They've actually got New Zealand forward observers, much like you see in Vietnam with Long Tan, with Maury and Stanley. You've got Kiwi forward observers, officers, and their parties able to call in artillery strikes. But because of the hills at the time, a lot of the radio communications were slightly dodgy as well. So getting the artillery to come in when it was needed was a bit fraught as well. So,
was there any other support for our forces? Were we able to have any air support?
Most definitely. US Marines and US Air Force fighter planes supported the Australians at Kapyong. And unfortunately, a nasty incident occurred with a Corsair dropping napalm in Australian positions, and it killed a number of guys, and a couple of guys, and badly burnt a number of others. But the marker panels, even though they were laid out, weren't seen. But they unfortunately dropped their napalm too short, and it went through the Australian positions. And one of the veterans I've spoken to over the years had been in a foxhole right near where the canister came down, and the napalm moved so quickly it missed his foxhole, but burnt a few of his friends. So he remembered that quite vividly. So when he was talking to me about his experiences at Kapyong.
But it was really the artillery that did most of the saving for us.
Very much. You cannot give too much credit to the New Zealanders.
And Michael, is there not a parallel here with Long Tan in Vietnam, where we've got a small Australian force literally going to be overwhelmed by massive numbers? And again, admittedly we had 105 millimetres, but you've got this great artillery, pinpoint accuracy, great calls with our observers that really saved the day.
This action does actually save Seoul, even though there is a bit more of a withdrawal. The Chinese push isn't actually halted outside of the city and then pushed back the following month.
Yeah, so it blunts the attack.
Very much.
So what does MacArthur say about our troops?
MacArthur has been relieved at this stage. He basically, as he's been replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, MacArthur when he crossed the 38th parallel, rather than actually just stopping and adhering to what the UN mandate was at the time, which is the saving of the Republic of Korea, he pushed to go forward and misread or interpreted the intelligence he was being fed back, and his intelligence people missed this entirely, was that if they had crossed the 38th parallel, the Chinese warned that they would come in and stop their border being threatened, and also look after the North Koreans. What MacArthur missed after he crossed the 38th parallel, with aircraft flying over, signals intelligence, and even human intelligence with deserters and other things like that. Several 100,000 Chinese crossing the Yalu and being sort of hidden in trees and away from aerial observation. So they put a massive force across the Yalu to oppose MacArthur. And as MacArthur got closer, or his forces got closer and closer to the Chinese border, the Chinese acted. And there's an old Chinese saying of open the gate, entice the dog, close the gate, and beat the dog. And this is what they did, very much so, as the American and South Korean forces drove on toward the Yalu. The Chinese closed the door behind the South Koreans and the Americans, and then started to beat them. And then you see entire battalions cease to exist. South Korean regiments get wiped out. The Marines, British and also the who are serving alongside the US Marines, fight a huge. They don't call it withdrawal; they call it an attack in the opposite direction. But they have a fighting withdrawal back to the ports to get away. But it's a huge action where they are supported by massive air support, artillery. They fight this withdrawal against overwhelming odds of Chinese odds and are able to get away and are evacuated off the beaches by the Navy.
And as you said, Incheon was MacArthur's high watermark, but then he is disgraced. He's stripped of command, and it must have been a terrible thing for him, and indeed the whole forces of the Allied servicemen in Korea at that time.
I think MacArthur had lost his luster when the Chinese had hit his forces really hard, and morale was at a rock bottom ebb. And MacArthur had wanted to use the nuclear option, and that didn't agree with Truman. And there was a number of politicking things that were going on behind the scenes, not just on the combat front. And when Truman relieved MacArthur and put Matthew Ridgway, who's a World War II general as well, I mean, famous for Bastogne and things like that, and D-Day. He's a guy who comes in with more of a gentle hand, and he actually wants to reinvigorate the morale of his men and get them fighting and get them winning victories again. So after the Kapyong battle, the UN forces go onto the offensive, and there's limited operations that are conducted by the UN command forces going forward. And that basically concludes in October of 1951 when Operation Commando is run and won by the Commonwealth Division and the 5 divisions of the US I Corps, moving up to the Jamestown line and occupying that. And the Battle of Mariang San is fought there. But that's the last time the line really moves forward. After that, the armistice agreements begin initially at Khe Sanh, and then there's a period of several months where, even though there's a bit of action going on the front line, they don't actively attack each other whilst these armistice negotiations are going on. Basically, it gives the Chinese time to dig in, and literally dig in almost like the Western Front. So they've got a massive trench system behind their forces by January 1952.
So can you give us an overview now of the course of events for the rest of the war?
Yeah, basically become what they call the static war, but it's anything but. It takes on tones of, as the armies have gone on to dug in front lines, it takes on the tone of something of the Western Front. So you've got patrol actions and raids and things like that going on throughout the rest of the war, whilst little bits of ground change hands here and there on the east and the west coast. But there's some fairly significant actions fought on raiding Chinese positions. The Australians take part in a number of them as well. And they also take part in defending a last-ditch Chinese assault in the last 3 days of the war in the Samachon Valley at a place called the Hook. The Hook's been attacked literally since October 52, which is when the Chinese first tried to get it en masse from the Marines who were holding it. But the Chinese put in one last-ditch effort, even though they know the armistice is getting signed in a couple of days, that to try and actually take significant high ground overlooking the Imjin River and giving them an attack route straight into Seoul again. This battle is fought by the US Marines and the Australians with air and artillery support, again with the New Zealanders and basically the entire I Corps and artillery, defeating this division-sized Chinese attack against no more than a couple of brigade-sized positions. So it's again this really last-ditch fingernail sort of stuff in the last couple of days of the war, and the Chinese are beaten back with massive casualties, and basically an entire division is not quite wiped out, but is rendered ineffective by the casualties they suffer at the hands of the defenders.
So Michael, by war's end, what are our casualties for this conflict?
The Australians suffer 340 men killed during the war. 43 of those are still missing. There's a chap called Ian Saunders, whose father is one of the missing, who is still agitating for remains to be identified, and is doing a great job trying to have those men found and given a burial.
Yeah, rightly so.
Yeah, and there's about 1,200, bit over 1,200 men wounded as well. So because the Air Force casualty figures are a bit sketchy, there could be a lot more, but there's about 1,216 men wounded. 29 Australians are taken prisoner. 6 of those are from the RAAF, and the rest are from the Army. And there should be one more figure from the RAF pilot I mentioned before, who was shot down and captured.
Yes,
as well.
I was wondering about him. What happened?
Yeah, he was released at the end of the war as well, but and went home. But unfortunately, we don't count because they're RAF attached to our squadron. They're not counted as part of our casualties, sadly, which is what they should be.
So, what was the homecoming like for those Korean boys?
A lot of it was quite mixed. I mean, 1 and 2 RAR, who fought the Static War, supporting 3, got to go home as full battalions and have their parade. 3 RAR stayed in theatre for the entire war, but kind of like Vietnam with replacements, they had men rotating on an individual basis in and out of the battalion, so that they did their year in country and then went back home. And some guys went back up for a second go, but when they got home, a lot of the guys were turned away from RSLs. The current head of the Korean War Veterans Association of Australia, Vic Day, when he got home to Victoria, went to his local RSL, and they shut the door in his face and said, "Well, come back when you fought a real war," sort of thing. And they were quite condescended to.
Michael, I've heard of that insult happening, sadly, to our Vietnam boys. I hadn't heard that it was extended to the Korean boys. It's just disgraceful.
It's terrible. And this is veterans of wars. And a number of these guys had fought in the Second World War as well, coming back. And then, I mean, I think they were able to join the RSL, had joined the RSL anyway. But guys who had just fought in Korea were not ignored, but they were not treated with the respect that they were due. Because, I mean, they did fight a very nasty war.
And we haven't even spoken about the weather.
Yeah.
The cold.
And the heat. It's both extremes in Korea. Literally at the Hook in July of 1953, the stench of death there from the rotting corpses from previous battles from the months previous was extreme and obscene. And the guys who served up on there felt they could smell the place before they even got near it. It was that bad, like a charnel house. And they said there's accounts of diggers turning over trenches, trying to dig out trenches and re-dig the trenches, and coming across body parts every turn of the earth. And the heat, the summer heat in Korea is obscene and can be tropical and hot. And fighting in those conditions is terrible. And on the opposite, the winters are almost like what German soldiers, I guess, would have experienced in Russia during the Russian campaign. Extreme cold, weapons freezing, vehicles' engines freezing up, things like that. I mean, they had to really care for their weapons and things like that during the combat to make sure they remained in working order. So special oils, heating engines, even to the extent of lighting fires under their trucks to keep the oil loose. And
we heard the Germans do a lot of that.
Yep, and it had parallels in Korea too.
So the war ends, but Australia's involvement in Korea doesn't end.
No, it still hasn't. We are signatories to the armistice. So if the North does, heaven forbid, invade, we are technically straight away at war with supporting the Republic of Korea and their right to their sovereignty. But in 1953, we changed over from war footing to a peace enforcement footing. So 3 RAR remained in Korea until 1954. 2 RAR left Korea in 1954 and then were deployed to Malaya in 55 as part of the Malayan emergency. 1 RAR went back up into Korea over the 1954-55 period. And the last Australian troops were withdrawn in 1957. But we still have a UN advisor up there these days as part of the UN Commission. So it still has resonance today with not just the armistice, but also it very much informs our defence policies, Navy, Army, and Air Force today with looking at what China's doing in the South China Sea, the Korean belligerents as well, with the Kim family still in control. It still very much has an effect on our defence policies and our forward look.
So how would you rate our role in the war and its importance?
I think the size of our force is relatively small, and this is something that President Truman actually commented on earlier on in the Korean War. Australia could field pretty much 6 full infantry divisions by the end of the Second World War, regular AIF and militia. And by 4 years later, they literally could not field 1 battalion. And it's K-Force that basically saves the fledgling Australian Regular Army from becoming an insignificance. So it has massive effect on the Army, Navy and Air Force in a lot of ways in its ability to maintain its strength post-war. But it's one of those things where you wonder, if it wasn't for Korea, what would have happened to our Defence Forces? Because the numbers, about 17,000 Australians served in total in Korea. But the Army was actually able to fill 3 battalions. The Air Force had obviously 77 Squadron and also transport squadrons flying over there as well. And the Navy had a number of destroyers and frigates, plus the Sydney that went up as well. So each played its significant role and played its part. So despite the small numbers of our force over the 3 years of the war, they contributed materially to the sovereignty maintaining the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea, but also helping stop the war as well. So I think they did play their part and play it well.
So why is Korea today known as the forgotten war in Australian society?
Even in 1951, after the Battle of Mariang San, when the lines went quiet or static, the diggers noticed that the media and all the interest sort of disappeared from Korea. And they started calling themselves forgotten, even in late 1951 and early 52, when the interest actually seemed to go away from all the media because the sexy part of the war had finished. So it was now this long, drawn-out negotiation, but still 2 years of combat. So I think even the diggers had started to call themselves forgotten during the war, but where the real term comes from is it fell in between the end of the Second World War and the war weariness of the Australian public, and then the Vietnam War, where it was initially supported, but then by the late 1960s, public opinion had turned well and truly against Vietnam, and the idea of remembering past wars was really on the nose with a lot of people. Not all of the nation, there were still many that remembered, but people remembered World War II because of the size of it, and Vietnam because of the unpopularity of it. But Korea just disappeared. And just off the nation's psyche. But historians, soldiers, even members of family members who had lost loved ones over there always remembered Korea. So it was never truly forgotten, but the wider nation's memory had faded.
So what lessons could we take from Korea today?
We certainly look at how we warfight. I mean, the doctrine and all that sort of thing has changed, but how we operate with allies. Looking at, we had to fight alongside Americans, Turks, Filipinos, Thais. There was 21 nations of the United Nations that fought there, and fighting alongside allies who have different weapons, different ammunition, equipment structures, just how to operate in a military theatre with allied armies who are using different equipment to you is one of the lessons that is still sometimes being learned in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and current conflicts. But just looking at how we operate on that inter-allied sphere is where we still draw lessons from, say, the Second World War, Korea, and even Vietnam, and learn the lessons and look back in history to see what those can teach us and how we can actually carry on into future operations with allied nations without minimal fuss, but and keeping the politics out.
So, Michael, we've just seen the Winter Olympics finish. North Korea and South Korea pooled a sporting team. What hope have we got for the future?
I think it bodes really well for the two Koreas. There may not be a chance to pull down the walls of the demilitarised zone, but having that greater access to each other's countries or each other's people mean that families who've been separated by the Korean War for over 65 years now have greater access to each other, hopefully, and visits will be hopefully more reciprocal, and the future looks rosy. But there's the great achievement of the North and South Korea industrial zone as well around Kaesong, where industry is maintained by North and South in this particular zone as well. It does have its moments where the border does get closed, but looking at the Olympics and looking at positivity that sport can bring to nations, I think the future looks pretty good for Korea on that front.
Michael Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your service with the Army, and especially thank you for bringing to life the service of our veterans in Korea, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, particularly 3RAR, whose deeds have been outstanding and are so understated today. It's a war that must not be forgotten, and thanks to you it won't be. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Angus.
You can find the Australian War Memorial online at www.awm.gov.au and on social media. And do look up more of our conversations with Australian War Memorial historians in our podcast feed. Already out this season are the episodes Australia in Afghanistan with Dr. Rhys Crawley and Beyond the Legend with Dr. Carl James. Last year, Thomas Kay covered the Special Forces exhibit that was also mentioned in this episode. For that conversation, listen to Australia's Special Forces with Dr. Carl James. And last year, I discussed the Nazi-Soviet front in World War II, in the Eastern Front with David Sutton. I also interviewed an Air Force veteran and now council member of the Australian War Memorial in our second episode, number 2, Sharon Bown. And finally, I spoke with the director, the Honourable Dr. Brendan Nelson, in Remembrance Day with Dr. Brendan Nelson. If you haven't yet, be sure to check those out. You can get in touch with us on social media. We're Life on the Line Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and LOTL Pod on Twitter. Join the conversation there. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, and our email address is podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Subscribe in your podcast app of choice to get all veteran conversations on Tuesdays and bonus episodes like this chat with Michael Kelly on Fridays. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget.